The SUV died somewhere between mile marker 43 and the end of everything Evelyn Carter believed she could control. No signal, no heat, no one coming. Just the Colorado Rockies swallowing the road whole under 3 feet of fresh snow, and the temperature outside dropping fast enough to make staying in the car a slow, quiet death sentence. She had been sitting in the dark for nearly an hour, watching her breath fog against the windshield when the flashlight beam cut through the storm and hit her window like an accusation. A man stood in the white, rifle over one shoulder, a child's handprint visible on his jacket sleeve, pressed there in paint, blue, dried, permanent. He looked at her through the glass and said 4 words, "You need to come." Most people would have locked the door. Evelyn Carter unlocked hers and got out of the car anyway. And that single decision, that one moment of choosing trust over control, was about to change everything she thought she understood about both. Here is something most of us never learn until the moment we most need it. The instinct to protect yourself and the instinct to isolate yourself can feel exactly the same from the inside. Both feel like wisdom, both feel like survival. The difference only becomes visible in hindsight, and by then the cost of confusing them has already been paid. The walk took 20 minutes. Evelyn counted every one of them because counting was a way of staying calm, and staying calm was the only thing she could still control. The man moved ahead of her through the trees without looking back. His flashlight cut a narrow path through the dark. He hadn't offered his name, he hadn't asked for hers. He had simply turned and walked, and she had followed, because her fingers were already numb, and her coat, which had been perfectly adequate for a business trip to a heated conference room in Denver, had not been built for this. The snow came sideways, the trees gave almost no cover. By the time a light appeared between the branches, warm and amber, the shape of a window, she had stopped calculating whether this was a mistake and started thinking only about heat. The cabin was small. That was the first thing she registered. 1 story, rough-cut timber, a porch stacked with firewood that went up to the roofline on one side, dense and organized, the kind of supply that wasn't prepared for a few cold nights, but for an entire season of deliberate isolation. No car in the yard, no satellite dish, no signs of anything modern except a hand pump generator humming faintly near the back wall. Evelyn had grown up without much. She knew what scarcity looked like, but this was a different kind of without, deliberate, sealed off, like someone had chosen to erase themselves from the world and had been methodical about it. The man held the door open. She walked in. The inside was warmer than she expected. A wood stove in the corner threw out real heat, and the smell of something, pine smoke maybe, soup, cut through the cold that had settled deep in her chest. The space was a single open room, with a kitchen along one wall and a couch along another, worn flat from years of use. A child's drawing was pinned to the cabinet above the sink, crayon mountains, a yellow sun, 2 stick figures holding hands. A pair of small boots sat by the door, still dusted with snow. Everything was clean, but nothing was new. Nothing had been purchased recently or casually. Every object in that cabin had been chosen and kept. A girl appeared from the back hallway. 8 years old, maybe. Dark eyes that matched her father's exactly. A sweater 2 sizes too big, pulled down over her hands. She looked at Evelyn the way children sometimes do, directly, without performance, without the filtered social calculation that adults layer over every first impression. She looked and she assessed. Then she said, "Are you cold?" Just that. "Very," Evelyn said. The girl nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected and disappeared back down the hall. She returned 30 seconds later carrying a wool blanket that smelled of cedar. She held it out with both arms and waited until Evelyn took it. Then she looked up at the man, her father, and said, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had already thought several steps ahead, "I set the extra bowl out." He said, "Good, Lily." That is how she learned their names. His by process of elimination. His daughter called him Dad throughout the evening, and the one time Evelyn asked directly, he answered the way he answered most things. "Jack," he said, and turned back to the stove. Evelyn sat at the table and watched him. He moved efficiently, without waste, the practiced economy of someone who had learned to do everything alone and had stopped resenting it. He ladled soup into 3 bowls, set bread on a board, poured water from a ceramic pitcher. He didn't make conversation, and he didn't seem to expect any. Lily filled the silence instead, talking about a bird she'd seen that morning with an unusual wing pattern, asking Evelyn whether she had ever seen snow like this before, explaining with complete seriousness that their nearest neighbor was 11 miles away and had a dog named Gerald, who in her estimation was not very smart. Evelyn found herself answering. She didn't entirely mean to.
There's a psychological phenomenon that researchers call involuntary disclosure. The way that genuine warmth from another person, especially a child, can bypass the walls we've spent years building. It's not manipulation. It's just what happens when someone is fully, uncomplicatedly present with you. You start talking. You start being there too. After dinner, Jack showed her where she would sleep. A narrow room off the main hall, a cot, a folded blanket, a small window that looked out into nothing but white. He said the storm was forecast to last through the following day. He said the road would be impassable until it cleared. He stated these facts without apology or particular warmth, the way a person delivers information they had no part in creating and feel no responsibility for softening. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I'll arrange payment when I can reach my phone." Jack looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not offense exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that looked more like recognition, like he'd heard that particular kind of distance before and knew exactly what it was protecting. "That's not necessary," he said, and pulled the door to her room almost shut behind him. She lay on the cot in her clothes and stared at the ceiling. The wind hit the cabin in long, rolling waves. Through the thin wall she could hear Lily's voice, lower now, the bedtime register, and Jack's responses, brief and even and steady. The sound of a man who had learned to be enough for one small person when there was no one else. Evelyn had not shared a roof with anyone in years. She lived in a penthouse in Denver with floor-to-ceiling glass and a kitchen she used only to make coffee. She had an assistant, 2 personal security staff, and a board of directors who required a scheduled appointment to reach her. She had built that life intentionally, one controlled layer at a time, because control was the only thing that had ever reliably kept her safe. She was not in control of anything right now. She closed her eyes and told herself it was one night. The storm would break, she would get back on the road, she would make the meeting 2 days late, and she would fix whatever needed fixing the way she always did. This was temporary. This man, this child, this cabin in the middle of nowhere, none of it was real life. It was a detour. She almost believed it. What she could not explain lying there in the dark was the sound of Jack's voice through the wall. Not the words, just the tone. And why it made her feel for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she was somewhere that wasn't completely indifferent to whether she was alive or not. She didn't examine that feeling. She filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things she didn't have time for, and she went to sleep. Outside, the storm pressed down on the mountains without mercy. The trees bent, the road disappeared, and somewhere, 11 miles away, Gerald the dog was presumably not very smart in the warm. The second day began the way the first had ended. Snow, wind, no signal. Evelyn woke before anyone else and sat on the edge of the cot in the gray pre-dawn light, running her mental inventory of what she knew. She was stranded in a cabin in the Colorado Rockies with a man she had met less than 12 hours ago and his 8-year-old daughter. Her phone was dead. Her car was buried somewhere on the highway. Her assistant would have flagged her absence by now, but without a location, there was nothing anyone could do until the storm broke. She was, by every practical measure, completely dependent on a stranger, and that fact sat in her chest like a stone. She came out to find Jack already at the stove. He handed her a cup of coffee without being asked, black the way she took it, though she had never told him that. She didn't mention it. She sat down and drank. The morning passed slowly. Lily did schoolwork at the kitchen table, handwritten exercises in a worn notebook, the kind of curriculum assembled by hand rather than downloaded, chosen carefully, not conveniently. She worked without complaint, occasionally reading sentences aloud to no one in particular, occasionally asking Evelyn to spell something, which Evelyn did, and which seemed to satisfy Lily as much as any answer could. Jack moved in and out of the cabin, checking the generator, clearing snow from the roof over the porch, splitting wood in short, efficient strokes that Evelyn could hear through the wall like a metronome. She noticed the door on her second pass down the hallway. It was set into the wall between the bathroom and what she assumed was a storage closet. Unremarkable, except for the deadbolt, a keyed deadbolt, not a turnlock, installed from the outside. In a cabin this size, in a house where a child lived, that was an unusual choice. She kept walking. She filed it away the way she filed most things, quietly and without reaction, and went back to the main room. The blood she found by accident. As she was helping Lily clear the lunch dishes, she dropped a spoon and crouched to pick it up. And there it was, a dark stain near the base of the cabinet by the back door, low on the floorboard, the kind of thing you would never see unless you were already at floor level. Old, scrubbed at but not removed. The grain of the wood had absorbed it long ago. Her eyes moved from the stain to the back door, to the window beside it, and then she stood up, set the spoon in the sink, and said nothing. Lily chatted on about something she'd read in her science book. Evelyn answered in the right places. That afternoon she tried carefully to ask Jack about himself. She chose neutral ground, how long he'd lived here, whether he'd grown up in Colorado, the kind of questions that could belong to anyone making ordinary conversation. Jack answered each one with the minimum number of words required, and then redirected. More coffee? Did she need anything? The storm should break by tomorrow. He was not rude, he was precise. There was a difference, and Evelyn understood it immediately, because she had spent 20 years being exactly the same way with people who got too close. She recognized the architecture of those walls. She had built her own from the same material. That recognition unsettled her more than the locked door had. The moment that cracked the surface came after dinner, when Lily was helping Evelyn stack firewood beside the stove. They had been working in comfortable quiet for a few minutes, when Lily said without preamble, "Dad doesn't sleep much." Evelyn kept stacking. "A lot of people don't," she said. "He walks around at night," Lily continued. "He thinks I don't hear him, but I do." She set a log down carefully, lining up the edges the way her father had shown her. Then she looked up. "He told me it was going to be okay, but then we moved here." Evelyn set down the log she was holding. "When was that?" 2 years ago. I was 6, Lily said. She picked up the next piece of wood. "I don't really remember our old house anymore, just the stairs." She didn't explain what she meant by that. She moved on to something else, whether Evelyn had ever seen a mountain lion and whether she thought they were scared of people or just pretending to be. Evelyn answered. Her voice was steady. Her mind was not. Just the stairs. She waited until Lily was in bed and Jack had gone out to check the generator before she moved. The kitchen drawer nearest the back wall, the deep one, the kind people use for maps and batteries and things they don't know what to do with. She told herself she was looking for a phone charger. She told herself she was just checking. She pulled it open and pushed past a folded map, a utility knife, a coil of wire, and found it near the bottom. Folded twice, worn soft at the creases. A newspaper page. She unfolded it carefully. The headline was local, a small Colorado County paper, the kind that covered town council meetings and hunting season results. The story below it was not small. A man is dead. The cause was listed as blunt force trauma from a fall. The primary suspect had fled before charges were formally filed, taking his minor daughter with him. The suspect was named. There was no photograph, but there was a description. Male, early 30s, dark hair, last seen near the town of Granby. The name at the center of the article was Jack Turner.
Evelyn stood in the kitchen with the paper in her hands and felt the floor shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. She read it twice. Then she folded it exactly as she had found it, placed it back under the utility knife and the coil of wire, and pushed the drawer shut. She walked to the couch and sat down with her hands in her lap and looked at the locked door down the hall. She thought about the stain on the floorboard. She thought about Lily saying, "Just the stairs." She thought about Jack's face when she had offered him money, that quiet, worn expression that was not offense, but something older than offense, something that had been weathered down over a long time into its current shape. She thought about the rifle over his shoulder when he'd found her on the road. She thought about the way he had handed her coffee without asking how she took it, the way someone does when they have spent years paying close attention to things no one gives them credit for noticing. She thought about Lily, asleep down the hall. The back door opened and Jack came in, stamping snow from his boots. He looked at her sitting on the couch. Something moved across his face, brief and unreadable. Then he went to the stove, added a log, and said, without turning around, "You should get some sleep. Road might be clear enough by morning." "Okay," Evelyn said. She went to her room and closed the door. She lay on the cot with her eyes open and her mind running calculations the way it always did, except this time the numbers didn't resolve. Every column she built came out different. "Dangerous man," said one side of the ledger. "He came out in a blizzard to find you," said the other. "Fled a murder charge. Brought a 6-year-old into the mountains alone to keep her safe." She didn't sleep for a long time. When she finally did, she dreamed about the drawer. In the dream, she unfolded the newspaper and the story was different, longer with more columns, a second page she hadn't found, but she woke before she could read it. The cabin was dark and cold, and somewhere outside, the wind had finally started to drop. She lay still for 10 minutes listening to it ease. Then she made a decision she already knew she would regret. Not because it was wrong, but because it would require her to be the kind of person she had spent 20 years carefully making sure she didn't have to be. She pulled on her coat, her boots, her gloves. She moved down the dark hallway, past the locked door, past Lily's room, and let herself out the back into the snow. She made it approximately 300 meters before her legs gave out. The cold hit differently at night, not the sharp cold of wind, but a settled, total cold, the kind that worked its way through fabric and skin and into the center of things. She had been walking in what she believed was the direction of the road, but in the dark and the snow, every direction looked exactly the same, and she had no flashlight, no landmarks, and the adrenaline that had carried her out the door had burned off completely by the time she went down on one knee in a drift that came up to her hip. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps in snow have a particular sound, compressed, deliberate, unhurried, and then the flashlight beam hit her. And Jack was there, a coat thrown over what looked like what he'd been sleeping in, his face not angry, not afraid, not vindicated, not any of the things a person might reasonably be when they find someone trying to flee their house in the middle of the night, just present. He reached down and pulled her to her feet without a word. He kept one hand on her arm the entire walk back, not gripping, just there, making sure she stayed upright. Inside, he sat her in the chair closest to the stove. He put a blanket around her shoulders. He didn't ask what she'd been doing or where she had thought she was going. He built the fire back up and stood beside it until the color came back into her hands. And then he said, in the same even tone he used for everything, "It's about 4 hours until daylight. You should try to sleep." Evelyn looked at him. His face in the firelight was tired in a way that went beyond one bad night, the kind of tired that had been accumulating for years, layer by layer, until it became simply the way a person looked. She thought about the newspaper in the drawer. She thought about Lily saying he cried for a really long time. She thought, this is not the face of a man who wants to hurt anyone. And then she thought, that is exactly the kind of thing a person thinks right before they find out they were wrong. She pulled the blanket tighter and said nothing. Jack turned back to the fire. The cabin was quiet except for the wood burning, and somewhere outside, the storm, finally beginning to let go. Here is the real lesson buried inside that silence, and it is one that applies every day in offices and relationships and courtrooms and conversations that never make the news. Judgment formed in the absence of information is just fear wearing the costume of logic. We call it instinct, we call it reading the room, but most of the time it is simply the story we already decided to tell, dressed up in whatever evidence happened to be within reach. The locked door, the stain on the floorboard, the newspaper. Evelyn had every piece of the puzzle except the one that made the picture make sense, and she nearly walked into a blizzard rather than ask for it. The storm was gone by morning. The mountains looked scrubbed clean, white and absolute in every direction, the sky above them a hard, cloudless blue. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window with her second cup of coffee and watched the light move across the snow and thought about the newspaper folded at the bottom of the drawer 3 feet behind her. Jack came in from outside and said the road was passable. A rescue crew had already been through once. She could see the tracks from the window. Someone would likely come back through within the hour. He said this the way he said most things, directly, without editorializing, giving her the facts and leaving the decision entirely to her. Evelyn turned from the window. She walked to the table and sat down. She looked at him until he met her eyes, and then she reached into the drawer behind her, took out the folded newspaper, and set it on the table between them. Jack looked at it for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not surprise, not quite fear, something more like recognition. The look of a man who has been waiting for a particular door to open and has finally heard the knock. He sat down across from her. "I found it in the drawer," Evelyn said. "I wasn't looking for it." "I know," Jack said. "I need to hear it from you, all of it." He was quiet for a stretch of seconds. Then he began. 2 years ago, Jack and Lily had been living in a rental house outside Granby, a small place, nothing much, but stable. Jack had been working construction, taking whatever jobs came through the county. On an evening in late October, he had stayed late on a site to finish a pour before the temperature dropped. He got home after dark. The front door was unlocked, which was not how he had left it. Lily was in the corner of the living room, behind the couch, not making a sound, the way children go silent when something has frightened them past the point of crying. A man was in the house. Jack didn't know him. The man was agitated, said things that didn't connect, moved in an erratic way of someone in the middle of something chemical. When Jack moved towards Lily, the man moved to block him. What followed happened in under a minute. A struggle near the top of the stairs, Jack trying to get between the man and his daughter, the man losing his footing and going down. The sound of it, Jack said, was something he would carry for the rest of his life. He called 911. He stayed. He told them exactly what had happened. The man who died, Jack said, had a brother on the county sheriff's department, and his family had been in that valley for 3 generations. He said this without bitterness, just as fact, as data, as the kind of information that explains an outcome without requiring anyone to be a villain in the classic sense, just people protecting what belonged to them. By the time anyone was willing to listen to his side of it, the story had already been decided. "Why didn't you fight it, stay and go through the process?" Evelyn asked. "Because the process was going to take 18 months minimum, and in the meantime, Lily was going to be placed with the state." He looked at his hands on the table. She'd already lost her mother. She was 6 years old. She'd watched something happen in her own house that she didn't understand. "I was not going to let the system take 2 years of her life to sort out a verdict I wasn't sure I was going to win." He stood up and went to the locked door in the hallway. He used a key from the ring on his belt and opened it. Evelyn followed him to the doorway and looked in.
It was a small room.
More of a large closet, with a folding table along one wall and 2 plastic storage boxes stacked in the corner. On the table were folders, printed documents, handwritten notes, photographs. 2 years of work. Call logs from a disposable phone, names and dates, a chain of custody for a piece of evidence, a glass from his kitchen that had been logged and then apparently lost before trial, a witness statement from a neighbor who had seen the man's car parked outside Jack's house twice in the week before the incident, which had never made it into the official record. "I've been building a case," Jack said. "I know that sounds—" He stopped, started again. "I know what it looks like from the outside, a man hiding in the woods with a box of papers, but it was all I had." Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at the table for a long time without speaking. She was not a lawyer, she was not a detective, but she had spent 20 years reading documents, assessing risk, identifying the places where a system had been bent to serve the people with the most leverage. She knew what a buried witness statement looked like. She knew what a missing piece of evidence meant in a case that had been decided before it was argued. The difference between justice and procedure is that procedure follows rules. Justice requires someone to care enough to look past them. She turned back to the main room. Lily was standing in the hallway in her oversized sweater, watching them both without speaking. She had the particular stillness of a child who has learned to read a room before entering it, assessing, measuring the weight of what the adults around her are feeling before committing to her own expression. Her eyes moved from her father to Evelyn and back. Then she walked over to the table where Evelyn had sat back down. She put her small hand over Evelyn's hand. She looked up at her and said, "Do you believe my dad?" The question was simple. There was nothing behind it except the question itself. No strategy, no performance, no awareness of how much was riding on the answer. Just a child asking the only thing that mattered to her. Evelyn looked at the hand on top of hers. Lily's fingers were cold from the hallway. The knuckles were a little rough, the way kids' hands get in winter when no one is remembering to apply lotion. It was such a specific, ordinary detail, the kind of thing you only notice when you are actually present, actually looking, actually there, instead of running calculations from behind the glass of your own fear. "Yes," Evelyn said, "I do." She heard Jack exhale slowly from across the room. The rescue truck came 40 minutes later. 2 men in county gear who had been working the highway since dawn, professionally cheerful, the kind of people who do a hard job without needing it acknowledged. They confirmed Evelyn's USV had been located and towed to a lot in the next town. They had a radio. Signal was back. Evelyn made 3 calls. The first was to her assistant, who had been coordinating a search since the previous morning and was audibly relieved. The second was to the company's head of legal affairs, whom she asked to pull every public record associated with a case out of Garfield County, Colorado, from 2 years prior involving a defendant named Jack Turner. The third call was to a private investigator her firm had used for due diligence on acquisitions, a man named Douglas Hale, who was thorough and discreet and owed her a favor she had never called in. She made the calls outside, standing in the snow beside the rescue truck, while Jack and Lily packed a small bag inside the cabin. When she came back in, Jack was standing by the door with a duffel over one shoulder and Lily's hand in his, ready to be wherever she directed, because he had run out of directions of his own. "You're not under arrest. You're not turning yourself in today. What you're doing is coming with me to Denver, where my attorneys are going to go through everything in that room and figure out the fastest path to getting this in front of a judge who hasn't already made his mind." Jack looked at her. Why? It was a fair question. She thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and then she thought about the simpler version of it, which was also true. Because someone should have done this 2 years ago. He didn't argue. He picked up the duffel and walked out to the truck. What followed was not fast or clean. The law rarely is. Evelyn's legal team spent 6 weeks going through Jack's documents, cross-referencing his records against the official case file, tracking down the neighbor whose witness statement had been omitted. The missing glass from Jack's kitchen turned out not to be missing at all. It had been misfiled under the wrong case number, sitting in county evidence storage for 2 years, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The case was reopened in the spring.
Jack was exonerated 4 months after that on a Tuesday morning in a courtroom in Garfield County, in front of a judge who read the new evidence without expression and then looked up and said the charges were dismissed in full. Jack sat very still when the ruling was read. He didn't react the way people do in films, no gasp, no fist raised and dramatic tears in the gallery. He just sat there for a moment with his hands flat on the table, like he was making sure the surface was real. Lily started school the following September, a real school, with a classroom and a teacher and other children and a lunch table where she apparently held court on the subject of bird migration patterns with a confidence that her teacher described in a note sent home in October as remarkable. Evelyn did not attend the court proceeding. She had 17 other things happening that week, and her presence would have turned it into something it didn't need to be. She followed it through her attorney and received the outcome by text message while she was in a board meeting. She read it under the table. She put her phone away and went back to the meeting. She thought about it for the rest of the day without meaning to. The letter from Lily arrived on a Thursday in November, forwarded from a legal office to Evelyn's assistant to Evelyn's desk. It was on a piece of notebook paper, the wide-ruled kind with a red margin line on the left, sealed with a sticker of a small yellow bird. The handwriting was the careful, uneven print of a child still working out how letters fit together, each word slightly different in size than the one before it. It said, "Thank you for believing my dad. I started school. There is a girl named Harper who sits next to me, and she has a dog. I told her about Gerald, but I did not tell her Gerald is not very smart, because that is not a nice thing to say. I hope you're warm." It was signed Lily Turner, the L written larger than all the other letters, the way children sign their names when they are proud of them. Evelyn read it twice at her desk in the glass tower in Denver, with the city spread out below her in every direction and the mountains faint on the horizon, white-capped and distant. She put the letter back along its original creases. She held it for a moment, looking out at the range she had driven through in October without knowing what she was driving toward. Then she put the letter in the inside pocket of her jacket, not in a drawer, not in a file, on her person, close. And there is the lesson that doesn't announce itself, the one that lives quietly inside everything that happened between mile marker 43 and that Tuesday morning in Garfield County. Control is not the same as safety. Isolation is not the same as protection. The walls we build to keep harm out are built from the same material as the walls that keep connection out, and they do not know the difference. Evelyn Carter had spent 20 years being the smartest person in the room and never letting anyone close enough to matter. And it took a blizzard, a stranger with a rifle, an 8-year-old girl with rough winter knuckles to show her what that actually cost. We are not built to do this alone. Not the grief, not the fear, not the long, slow work of being in the world without certainty. The moments that change us are almost never the ones we planned for. They are the ones that arrive sideways, in a storm, holding a flashlight, saying 4 words. She did not smile often. She had been told this in various ways by various people over the years, and she had never particularly disagreed. But in the elevator going down to her next meeting, with the letter in her pocket and the mountains in the window, and no reason she could have named precisely, she did.